All right, let's take this discussion forward. I'm joined by Lieutenant General Sanjay Kulkarni, defense and strategy expert. A very warm welcome to you, sir. One of Ukraine's deepest strikes into Russian territory, Lieutenant General, over 4,000 kilometers in. We're talking about 4,000 kilometers. Is this a turning point in how Ukraine is going to fight this war?
Good morning, Neha. Definitely a turning point. I'm sure Ukrainians are all out to pressurize Russia for talks, and more than anything else, they don't want to go to talk with having been seen defeated, because the Americans have time and again been reminding the Ukrainians, and so much so that the President of America has told Zelensky in certain terms that it's a lost war, and that Ukraine can do nothing other than rather surrender to the Russians. But Ukrainians have done it, and they've proved that they are capable of doing anything. And this, particularly when they say that they've been preparing for it for over 18 months, and then to be able to, put their trucks inside and then infiltrate, raid, and then carry on with this kind of a daring attack on 5 of the air bases. 3, of course, the Russians were able to hold on to it and repulse it. But the 2 air bases that stuck Murmansk and the Irkutsk is indicative that they lost 40 of their bombers, and that's a huge loss. But for just a few $100 drones that were fired on maybe about 170 odd numbers that they claimed to, and a loss of over $7 billion. And of course, these aircraft are not being manufactured any longer, but they're very strategic aircraft, bombers, once used for nuclear, now modified for cruise missiles, and almost 34% of the cruise missile capabilities of the Russians has been badly affected. I sincerely hope the war doesn't go beyond it, because if somebody gets a little more, I would say, a little more vindictive and nasty and say, no longer now, the Ukrainians pay for it and go along. Of course, the Russians did retaliate with over 400 odd drones and missiles, and would have caused a sizable amount of damage in Ukraine. But it's a huge loss of faith more than anything else. The Russians didn't expect it so deep in.
Absolutely, General. Absolutely. You know, it is a loss of face indeed for Russia. So 117 drones launched in a single night. You know, I also want to understand from you, sir, what does this really say about Ukraine's planning capability and strategic patience? You know, they've been waiting for so long to strike Russia this deep inside.
The Ukrainians cannot be underestimated. The Ukrainians always had a military potential, and they have tremendous amount. All our aircraft also were on numerous occasions in service after Ukraine, and the Ukrainians have been deeply involved with the big aircraft. So Ukrainians are not technologically bad. They are good. There's no denying the fact. And most of them have the Russian technology. So between the two countries, they are almost siblings. So there's nothing very much to say that who's better and who's not better. They're both are siblings. But having said that, I think the Ukrainians have, over the years, especially in the last about, ever since Trump has taken over in the second presidency, been showing Ukraine in a very bad light, that Ukrainians must surrender, but the Russians don't intend giving it them so easily. So the 24 hours, 72 hours of his taking over, the war would end. Nothing has ended. And in turn, the Ukrainians, imagine what a fantastic, I would say, super infiltrating with the trucks so close, and being able to use those small, absolutely a very few $100 drones being remotely utilized to ensure what kind of surveillance they must have undergone, what kind of risks they would have taken, and how well coordinated it must have been. And rightly so, when Zelensky says 18 months, it would indeed be that. And I'm sure the Russians would now, I sincerely hope that the talks that are to take place today and hereinafter, the war ends, rather than, because the Russians are in occupation of 20% of the Ukrainian territory. The Zelensky has gone in for kind of a accord along with Trump to give minerals, those rare minerals to America. So with all that in place, I think it's just a question of the egos now have to be resolved to ensure that Zelensky, of course, it can't be an unconditional ceasefire. Ukraine won't get any of its territory back, that's for sure. But the Russians would at least stop it now and let the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians, of course, not becoming members of the NATO. Not that is the only criteria. And territory loss, no membership of the NATO. I'm sure the Russians would rather give back all the prisoners, would give back all the children, give back all the things, and hopefully Ukraine comes back, because there is no support now for Ukraine. And as you rightly said there, it's their own. Imagine, it's entirely their own. Speaks volumes of their patience, speaks volumes of their innovation, speaks volumes of their daring raid, being able to do so deep inside that the Russians would have never ever imagined that they could have come so deep in, though they have arrested some people who were the truck drivers or whoever the trucks were so close to the airstrip, because they don't have that potential, neither do they have those kind of weaponry to go deep as 4,000 kilometers. And that's something the Ukrainians must be given full credit for what
Right,
they've
sir.
done. They have obviously made Russians go down on their knees at this point of time.